Minister is in that sense of denial, and he's sort of apologised, but he hasn't carried the can, has he? Where's the moral integrity of our leaders of our public services? Because in the same way that shareholders expect performance, we the taxpayers who pay the bills for the public sector, yes, we're the shareholders in the public sector, and we expect performance as well. We want our leaders of our public services, we want them to be held to account. We want them to be exceptional. As the fifth biggest economy in the world, we should have the brightest, the best leaders of our public sector. And yet the cost to us, the taxpayer, of extending Cressida Dick's contract by those few months before now she's had to step down, that's going to cost the taxpayer, give or take, £500,000 extra money. That's our cash. I say again, as a great nation, we should demand the best leaders that the world can provide, that the UK can provide for our public services. And yet, you look back in the NHS, just last year, there was a change in the leadership as Sir Simon Stevens left. We've got a situation where money has continued to be poured into the NHS, and yet, even pre-pandemic, waiting lists had doubled. We're now told that despite pouring in another $12 billion a year for the next few years into the NHS, waiting lists are going to soar even further over the next couple of years. You might have thought that was a crisis that might require some new leadership. What did the NHS do? What did the government do? They appointed an insider. Even though I know there was an incredibly high quality global leader in healthcare who was on that shortlist, who had a real plan for change. Instead, the government and NHS England have accepted the status quo. They've essentially accepted, we'll pour more money in, but the performance will not be any better. And I just don't think that's good enough. Where were the sanctions for the top Mandarin in the Foreign Office that stayed on holiday for about 12 days, possibly 2 weeks, during the evacuation crisis from Afghanistan last August? There has to be some proper accountability in our public services. And it seems to me that far too infrequently they admit their mistakes, they admit when things have gotten wrong, and they never say sorry. Instead, you get spin and cover-up and obfuscation, when actually I think that we, the public, who pay the bills, I think we want some clear-headed honesty. We all make mistakes in whatever we do, at all our walks of life, private, personal, business, whatever. If we were honest about them, if we don't cover them up, and if we say, look, I messed this up, I screwed this up, but we're going to learn from it, we won't do it again. I actually think that we, the public, would much prefer that. And actually, the public sector, our public services, would serve us much better if there was a willingness to accept mistakes and to learn from them. And that's why my view is that this is a key moment, not only for the Metropolitan Police leadership, but actually for leadership of all our police forces across the country. We must not replace Cressida Dick with someone from within the Met. I don't think that we should replace her with someone from within the UK police forces. I think we need bold, ambitious, big change. This is a real moment to press the reset button. I think we need one of the finest leaders from across the world. We need to look for the best, aim for the best, because actually, London is possibly the greatest capital city in the world, and we deserve the greatest leader of a police force in the world. That is my view. That is my Sunday sermon. Call me with your view. Do you think, actually, I'm wrong? Do you think that Cressida Dick should be replaced by someone from within, or should we look wider? Call me, 0344 499 1000, tweet us at Talk Radio, or text 87222. Stay with us. Coming up, we're going to be talking to London Assembly member Sean Bailey, former mayoral candidate, with his views about the replacement for the Met Police Chief. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Get a grip.
More talk, pure energy, more taste, more flavour, more outspoken than ever.
Clear-headed, honest opinion.
Lively debate.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk this Sunday morning. It's the 13th of February, and that Sunday's sermon of mine was about leadership and accountability across our public sector, across the public services, but also critically with the Met Police here in London. I'm delighted that my first guest this morning is someone who knows London incredibly well, who has stood up for Londoners and who knows the Met Police very well, because he's been a London Assembly member and of course stood for the mayoralty of London in the elections last year. He just lost out to Sadiq Khan, but his views will be fascinating on who we should replace Cressida Dick with, whether we should look from within the Met or from elsewhere. Sean Bailey, a very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us this Sunday. I really appreciate your time. So, Sean, you stood for the Mayor of London last year. You just lost out. Obviously, if you had won, then you would have had this big decision, Sean, wouldn't you, whether or not to extend the police commissioner's contract last autumn, and then indeed, if you had extended, what to have done with the situation now. So I guess my first sort of question, Sean, is if you had been the mayor, would you have extended Cressida Dick's contract, and then would you have asked her to step down given what had happened since that extension?
First of all, good morning to you, Richard. Good to see you again and all of your listeners. Before I answer that question, let me just go back to a point you made in your sermon. You talked about business and its comparison to politics, but there's one important difference. In business, your competitors try to outproduce you, to outcompete you. They try to be better than you. In politics, we're in a very strange situation now where your competitors just undermine you. And big political wins are gotcha journalism and making people look personally bad. And that's why a lot of how our politicians behave, that's where it comes from. The other thing is, as well, of course, everything wrong with society apparently is a fault of politicians. And when I got involved in politics, my whole big thing was to give the rest of society the opportunity to do for itself, be that poor people, give them the opportunity to not be poor or to grow civil society. This country is great because of its civil organisations, not because of its politicians. Having said all of that, it would have been far better to have that natural change point when Cressida's initial contract had come to an end. It is very convenient for Sadiq Khan to suggest that the calamity that she's had in the intervening period, and let's be clear, the behaviour of some of her officers has been an absolute calamity. You know, that's pushed him to the final point. But I would say this to anybody listening: as much as Cressida Dick is the senior management of the police service in London, so is Sadiq Khan. He is correct to demand a plan from her, but we are correct to demand a plan from him, and that has not been forthcoming yet. And that plan was demanded over a year ago.
Sure, I get that, and I understand why, politically, you rightly hold him to account, but I think rightly he's held the head of the Met Police to account. I just think it's taken far too long because, of course, she was responsible for operational matters, and she'd been in place for 5 years. And I guess those cultural issues, it's the culture, isn't it, that I guess a lot of people are really quite worried about, as well as the performance.
So let's be clear. Sadiq Khan was correct to hold her to account. It's very rare that I'll tell people that Sadiq Khan is 100% right. On this, he was. Where the problem lies is he has been the Mayor of London for 6 years. She's been the police commissioner for more than 4 or 5 years now. Why did it take so long? Why did it take so long? That's one thing. The second piece is as well, right? The culture of the police service will never be dealt with only by the commissioner. Whoever that individual is, he or she has to tread the line between being a copper's copper, a politician, and doing what the Mayor of London wants. That can only happen if the Mayor of London supports he or she in that endeavour, and I don't believe he did. So yes, Cressida Dick had some failings, but so did Sadiq Khan, and that's what I'm saying. But we have to be fair here. Her stepping down at this time is the right thing to do.
I think that's right. I mean, in fairness, I've been calling for Cressida Dick to resign actually from straight after the fiasco over the vigil to Sarah Everard.
But again, Richard, when you look at that, when Sadiq Khan was questioned, he said it's a conversation between the police and the government. Utterly wrong. It's a conversation between him, the public, and the police, and he knew that, and he was dodging the bullet. That's why I say you'll always hear me call his name.
And absolutely, I get that. So, in a sense, look, we agree finally the right thing has happened. And I think there's a big moment now, a really big opportunity to look for the brightest and the best. And in my view, we both know that this is an incredible city, if not the best city in the world, one of the best cities in the world. And we should demand the best leadership of an institution so important to London as the Met Police. So, what's your view on this? Would you be looking from within, or do you agree with me that we need to be looking globally?
I heard your sermon, very good sermon, by the way, and I'm surprised that everybody's saying, can we look internationally? Let's be very clear. This is one of the top jobs in the entirety of the world. The safety of 10 million Londoners is at stake here. So I would always look worldwide. And you could come from Patagonia, Westminster or Washington. If you were the right person for the job, you're the person I would get in. It's as simple as that. So I don't see why we have to have a debate as, should we have someone from outside of the UK or outside of Met? Of course we should.
And I'm heartened to see. Yes, I'm heartened to see, for example, in one of the papers that Priti Patel has given that message that she's, looking globally. But here's the other big question: does it have to be a police officer, Sean, in your view, or actually should we, for example, look to some of our amazing leaders of our armed forces, whether it's a current officer or a recently retired officer, who's got that experience of running a big organisation, strong on discipline, strong on logistical support, getting things done and making things happen?
I would say yes is a short answer to that. Let me just tell you the one fly in the ointment. Whoever takes over now will not be getting a fresh start. What's going on in the Met has been a 30 and 40 and 50-year problem. and there is entrenched, and they're going to have an absolute mountain to climb. So whilst I'm very in favour of looking for someone outside of the service, you still need someone who understands that world, as it were, you know, a unionised world, a world with long-standing traditions. I mean, these are officers of the crown. So, for instance, I don't think you could get a Fortune 500 CEO in who expects to click his fingers and things happen. I don't think it happened like that. But I do think you could get someone in from another uniformed service. So, I mean, we have got some magnificent army officers who could do this. And in one sense, that may give them a bit of an edge because they're not part of the group, but it also would mean they'd have to figure out the very, very particular culture of the police.
I think that's right. And it may well be that actually it's such a big job and such a big challenge and so important to Londoners, as you quite rightly said, and also actually so important to the country, that if it's someone from, let's say, the armed forces, they probably will need to bring some assistance, people from outside, a team with them to make sure that change of culture, that change of accountability and performance is driven down through the organisation faster and quicker without being blocked. As is quite often the case with big organisations.
Exactly. I mean, let's be clear. All of what you said is correct and possible as well. What we need to look at, it doesn't need to be done the way it was done before. One individual internally who then slogs through it and has to undo all their professional relationships and friendships to get things done. You could get someone from outside. They would have a different challenge, but also they'd have some advantages. And they should be allowed to bring a team because the Met as an organisation has some problems, but also it has a lot of good in it. You'll find that the vast majority of individual officers are absolute heroes and joined to make a change for their community or to keep people safe or whatever. But there is a nub in there that needs to be changed. And also as well, we're in the 21st century. Things are done slightly differently. You need someone who's aware of that. And look, I make the obvious claim, you know, you could get someone from the armed forces, but there's other people from different police forces around the world, from different organisations that could also make that change.
Absolutely right. And just help my listeners and viewers, Sean, is this process completely secret, or is there any transparency to it at any stage?
Semi-opaque is the words I would use. but I would say this, that the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, saying that she wants a slightly slower process so it can be more considered, would suggest it'll be as open as it's ever been, possibly more. I think we're all in a mindset that we could take someone who's not the usual suspects. But it ultimately is a public appointment, so there is enough transparency for us to see who that person is. And on the London Assembly, for instance, we will have many emotions challenging what's going on. And of course, there will be a hearing as to who gets a job and why they've got the job. Make no mistake, we will get someone qualified, love them or hate them, we will certainly get someone qualified.
So do you London Assembly members have some form of scrutiny hearing with the chosen candidate or with a shortlist? How does that work?
We certainly will have a meeting with the chosen candidate. I hesitate. It would be great if we got to have a bigger say in who is picked. That's a job for the Home Secretary and the Mayor. But we will certainly be waiting for that candidate and hold them to account and give them a good steer as to what they can do. Because whoever the candidate is, even if it's an internal one, we on the Assemblies have spent years and years poring over the issues and will be able to give them some insight into the challenges they will be facing.
I think that's right, because actually, in a sense, the importance of this appointment and everything that may flow from it is actually, it should be above politics, because it's about ensuring the safety of Londoners. It's about reducing the hideous murder rate, for example, last year of teenagers, which I think was at a record high, knife crime up, and the appalling low solving of crimes. The charging rate, I think, now is down around 7%, sort of halved in the last 4 or 5 years.
That's so correct. And what I want to say, Richard, for your listeners who are outside of London, who are saying, here we go again, London, 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 I'll give you this one fact to bear in mind. Crime in London now, under Sadiq Khan, has been so bad, we're now exporting crime to other parts of the country. The technical term is county lines. So you could be sitting in the middle of Shropshire, Leeds, or somewhere else, minding your own business and have to deal with a criminal who originated in London. That's why it's important to all of us.
It is indeed. Sean, thank you so much for that. And we've just had a tweet come in. Agree 100%, Richard. I believe we should be looking for an individual from the security services, MI5 or elsewhere, who deal with the Met on a daily basis. That's from Martin. That's interesting. Sean, thank you very much for your thoughts. Really useful this morning here on Tice Talk. That was Sean Bailey, London Assembly member and former mayoral candidate. He knows a thing or two. Stay with us. Give us a call, 0344 499 1000. Lots more coming up on Tice Talk.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio. Common Sense Radio for common sense people.
Talk Radio. Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk this Sunday morning. Well, that was Sean Bailey just before the break talking about his views as to the replacement of the Met Police Commissioner. Interesting tweet here from Paul, who says, as a former police officer, I would strongly advise the new Met Commissioner must come from the military with a team of military officers. Simply isn't the talent within UK policing. That's absolutely fascinating. That actually concurs with my thinking that it needs to be someone from outside UK police forces. Tad here says, morning, Richard. We need someone like the former New York Mayor, Rudy Giuliani. I think that was in the earlier days. We must absolutely get rid of this woke culture in the police and come down heavy on criminals. Tad says box-ticking lefties have been an unmitigated disaster. I think many of us would agree with that. And one text that's come in here, Cresta Dick, enormous payoff and large pension, so wrong at all levels. Well, the reality is, look, someone's got an employment contract and that involves a pension. Of course, you have to stick with the contract. But as Sean Bailey was saying, in reality, her term of office came up last autumn. It shouldn't have been extended, and that has cost us, the taxpayer, a lot of money. We've got Derek in Dorset. to let us know his views. Good morning, Derek. What's on your mind?
Richard. I can't disagree with anything you've said this morning, which is unfortunate. Yes, we need a military commander to run the police. We need police cadets from diverse communities that used to be. We need an apprenticeship for police. Youngsters who couldn't pass the exam, but being in an academy, bring their education on. From the diverse society we now have in England, we need a strong leader that's not from one of these woke brigades, and you're quite right. People should be accountable. They do not need a degree to join the police. By demanding a degree, we're losing all the ex-military people that comes out of the army without degrees.
That's right. I've heard exactly that, actually, that there's far too much pressure to get a degree, when actually, frankly, as a police officer, the most important thing, I think, is you need a degree in common sense and an ability to get on with people, but also to essentially to use the law without fear or favour. That's absolutely critical. And also, as you say, actually, as I understand, I was speaking to a former police officer this week who said that in years gone by, there were many more people from the military. You know, they'd leave the armed forces and then they would come into the police. But that happens much, much less now.
Richard, you're absolutely right. I mean, as I said before, I was in the prison service. Don't undermine all the police. The vast majority of police are excellent people. And what's happened in New York, you have lawless streets now where they've underfunded the police, they've criticised them to such a degree that many left. And now in New York, they're paying the price. And Democrats are voting Republican because they realise what they've done. But this police academy, which I'm proposing for youngsters, some kids can't pass the exams, but with a bit of education and a bit of training, they would pass the exams. Fracking, you're absolutely right. Open up that gas field in the North Sea. Fracking, for goodness sake, you useless politicians, listen to talk radio.
Well,
and in Ukraine, I don't like this cut and run. I bet you, if you spoke to the military people, as an ex-military man myself, they'd be ashamed to the fact that they've been withdrawn from Ukraine. You should. I said yesterday, the Western world, like Sandy Shaw, had that hit, Puppets on a String. That's with Putin, the puppet master. The Western leaders are being just pulled here and there.
There's no question, Derek, he is playing a geopolitical game. You've moved sharply from Cressida to Dick way over to international matters. But and we're going to be talking about fracking and shale gas extraction later in the show, because, of course, it's not just fracking. There are other ways to extract shale gas. Derek, thank you very much from Dorset. And we've got Susan, who is in Exeter, also down in the southwest. Susan, a very good morning. What would you like to let us talk about today?
Very good morning to you, Richard. I'd just like to say, I don't know what the weather's like in your neck of the woods, but it's a filthy morning. It's pouring with rain. It's absolutely vile. I wanted to talk to you, first of all. I am saying a prayer. I don't really believe in God very much, but I'm saying a prayer for our brothers and sisters in the Ukraine, because I don't want to see a war, Richard, with anybody. And, I'm just praying hard it won't happen and we get loss of life, because loss of life is so
Susan,
awful.
we're all hoping for that. Of course, sadly, it's out of our hands. But
now, moving on, I know it's out of our hands. Moving on, I don't want to bore you. With the fracking, Richard, there's one thing I want you to understand, and that is, it's simply this: we've had 2 or 3 attempts of fracking carried out by engineers, and shortly after the procedure was attempted, we had miniature earthquakes. Now that tells you we're not geographically suited to it, geologically suited, Richard.
So here's the thing, of course. Let's remember that actually shale gas is the asset in the ground that we're looking to extract. There were some fracking attempts. The thing about it, what you call an earthquake, which sounds very scary, but actually anything above naught is technically termed an earthquake. But at a level of 2 on the Richter scale, which is basically, it's a logarithmic scale, so it's exponential in its growth. At 2, 2 is the equivalent of a lorry driving past your front door. I mean,
really?
Yes. So that's hardly an earthquake, is it? In most people's sort of common sense language.
Yeah.
That's
so
just.
Why did they stop? They pulled out, didn't they?
They did. I'll tell you why. Because the eco-zealots and the eco-bullies that were incredibly well-funded, we don't know where from, but we have some suspicions, they terrified weak, cowardly politicians who forgot to actually reflect on the fact that here is a huge quantity of treasure, golden gas treasure, under our feet. But I'll be talking about shale gas a bit later in the show, Susan. So,
what do you want to talk about now? What are you going to talk about now?
Well, shortly after the break, Susan, we are going to be talking about Ukraine with Bob Seeley, the MP for the Isle of Wight, because that is such a critical issue, as you touched on at the beginning. But just finally, Susan, your view on Cressida Dick and the Met Police replacement. Really big opportunity. What's your thought on that?
Well, she was never much cop, was she, Richard? We need to
The irony, the pun on cop, I love it.
Well, you know, I'm a great fan of the police because I've had to call them a couple of times in my life and they've been absolutely brilliant. I think we have a brilliant police force and they get a lot of, you know, we've had a bit of gossip and we've had them shown in a negative light recently, but I think they're brilliant. Think of it like this, Richard, we'd be no good without the police.
Oh, no, absolutely. We all support the police, there's no question about that, Susan. But what we need in the police and elsewhere, we need good leadership, strong leadership. That delivers results. Susan, thank you so much for your thoughts on a variety of matters. We've got the tweets coming in. We have one here from Pete who says 2 things. Was she the best person for the job or just put there because she was a fast-tracked woman? That's one question. And she can't be blamed for everything. Theresa May devastated the police force with massive cuts under Cameron's leadership and subsequently her own leadership. Interesting point there. Carl says, I'm not sure I agree with this, the applicants should sit a woke test. If they're going to continue politicising the police force, then it's with, what you're saying here, where it's not riot gear or taking the knee depending on your cause, it needs to stop. The respect for the police is now non-existent. I think the point is actually we all want to trust and have confidence in the police because it is such an integral part of a decent, democratic, civilised society. But I do think that trust and confidence has reduced significantly. Some might say it has collapsed, and that needs to be restored. I think we've got Carl in the Wirral. Carl, good morning to you.
Good morning, Richard. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. What would you like to say?
Well, there's a couple of things here. I mean, I think one of the important things regarding anybody that's leading the police needs to be impartiality. And we don't get that. We get, particularly in London, we've got we see them dancing and at the gay pride parades. We see them taking the knee for Black Lives Matter, and yet we see them coming in riot gear whenever there's a protest against anti-lockdowns. We had the issues last year with the veterans trying to protect the statue of Churchill and other statues in London, and they were pretty much vilified for that. So there seems to be a kind of...
It's the consistency, isn't it? There's a lack of consistency, and we need consistency because that builds trust. And you've got to apply the law evenly without fear or favour, whoever it is, whether it's a Prime Minister or whether it's someone on any type of demonstration.
Correct. I mean, and obviously this all stems from the leadership. I don't believe all the police are corrupt in any way at all. I think a lot of them are probably doing these frontline duties against their will. They're more or less being told what to do, and I'm sure they're not happy about it, particularly when they've got to start weighing into the public. Some of them do look like they relish it, but most of them probably don't.
I think you're right, Carl. Carl, I've got to go to a break, but thank you very much for that thought there. That was Carl from the Wirral. Coming up after the break, we're going to be talking to Bob Seeley, MP for the Isle of Wight, about Ukraine. Such a big issue here on Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
New. Best recipe ever. Talk Radio.
Captivating, campaigning, controversial.
Powered by Common Sense.
May cause mild irritation.
The word on the street.
Standing up for the little guy.
Rewire your thinking.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. 3 great calls there. Keep them coming in. 0344 499 1000. And of course, we need to look at matters not just domestic but also international. And was it a tweet or a text? It's a text has come in from Glenn, who says, with regards to Ukraine, history is repeating itself. Putin understands only force and the West is being weak. Well, let's talk to my next guest, who is Bob Seeley, Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight and a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, who served in the military and therefore is well placed with his thoughts on what's going on in Ukraine and whether or not we're responding correctly in the West. Are we responding in a unified way? And whether or not Putin is actually going to give the order to invade. Bob, a very good morning to you. So this is sort of critical times. It feels as though the pressure's ramping up, the diplomacy is ramping up. Firstly, Bob, do you think that we in the West are presenting a united front? Or do you think with different conversations going on between, let's say, Macron and Putin and Biden and Putin and Liz Truss and the foreign minister in Russia, are we being divided?
I think, well, good morning, Richard. Good morning to your listeners. The Russians are trying to divide us, and they're doing a reasonably good job at it. We're not being particularly united, although we're becoming slightly more united. And yes, we're 15 years too late to this. Putin declared, I read some article this morning saying we risk a new Cold War. I mean, really, I'm afraid to say this Cold War was declared by Putin back in 2007 in a very well-known conference speech in Munich in southern Germany. And it got a lot worse in 2014 when the first Ukraine war and the Crimean annexation. And I'm afraid to say we veered from complacency to panic to complacency to panic. We don't have a strategy for dealing with these new authoritarian states, how to protect ourselves, our values, our institutions, and we're paying a massive price.
And do you think there's a sort of reference by, I think actually one of your colleagues, that this is a sort of Munich moment? But I question, is it a Munich moment or is it more a sort of a Cuban Missile type crisis?
I would be wary of trying to find too many exact historical parallels. I think we have been sleepwalking into a much more dangerous world. You can compare that to the build-up to World War One, if you want, where we found ourselves accidentally in a devastating change of our world. But also by not calling out bad things when they're happening. You could say there are parallels with the 1930s as well. I wouldn't overstate either of those because themes repeat themselves, but I'm not sure history does. But for sure, we have been, I think we thought that the Cold War had ended and we thought we're all going to live in this liberal sort of benign world. And along comes China and along comes particularly Russia in our neck of the woods to say, actually, we're very unhappy with the status quo and we're going to change it and we're going to start changing it by force if need be. And I think it was just too difficult for us to get our heads around what that would mean. And the amount of Russian money coming into the city and the law firms, it was just too attractive. It's the same with Russian gas in Germany.
I mean, there's no question that I find it shocking that London essentially became a complete sort of transit point for money laundering from Russia, the oligarchs, and we were far too welcoming, big city investment banks, far too welcoming of money. And you sort of wonder how actually they were able to get over the sort of the money laundering, know your client type checks. But I think actually, in a sense, here in the UK and your colleagues, I should give credit where credit's due, Bob, that I think actually we have been talking tough. We've been talking about sanctions. There's obviously talk about whether or not Russia could be cut off from the SWIFT banking system. I think that we've been right up there. The question is,
but Richard, can I just? I mean, it's all right talking tough, but the problem is if you talk tough and then you don't really act.
Oh well, that's the thing, isn't it? So when is the time to impose sanctions? Does Putin believe we would impose sanctions? Okay. And what's the next step?
Well, let me reverse the question and ask it to you. Do you believe thus far that deterrence has worked?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, ultimately, probably not. But it depends really what's his objective. Is his objective to invade, or is his objective actually to deliberately create instability, to create division in the West? But actually, money talks. Is his real objective to increase the price of gas, to make people more dependent on him? That, I think, is, what do you view as his objective?
Okay, I'm not looking at the objective now, but let's just look at the broader objective, because I think that helps us answer the question. In his last decade in power, President Putin will absorb or dismember Ukraine, or try to. He will try to shatter the unity of the West, NATO. He will try to re-establish a sphere of influence, because that's how the Russians think. There are short-term things he wants to do to destabilize Ukraine. He may take another chunk of it. He may go for a full invasion now. But if he doesn't do this stuff now, in the next 10 years, he wants to destroy Ukraine, which he doesn't recognize as a state. He wants to shatter the unity of the West, and he wants to re-establish a Russian sphere of influence and actually fundamentally, re-establish Russia as a liberal and anti-Western state, true to its what's known as Slavophile instincts rather than Westernizing instincts. So that's his big strategy. And I think it would be helpful if we thought in that bigger terms, because it helps us to see that this isn't a problem that's going to go away. I think he is going to use military force, because I think he is very, very sensitive to perceptions of his status. And I think having got all this kit in place, he's not going to do nothing with it, because I think it would damage his credibility, although it is a big risk. And he is a very, very calculating man, and in some ways tactically brilliant, but strategically disastrous, although he does try to be strategically nuanced as well.
Okay, so are you of the sort of the Tobias school of thought, thinking that actually we should have had a NATO division in Ukraine to act as that deterrent, or do you think? I mean, that feels to me a step too far at this stage.
No, and it's dangerous nonsense, I'm afraid. Look, using the word strategy does not imply that you think strategically. It is very important, and I agree with Tobias, that we don't talk enough about strategy, which is why I say we should have realised that the new Cold War had started in 2007. I saw the headline in the piece. He said, we risk a Cold War. Sorry, I don't know who wrote that headline, but it's nonsense. We actually risk a hot war. We've been in a Cold War for some time, and I do think it's important that we get our basic understanding correct. And talking about strategy does not mean you come up with the right answers. And actually just throwing a few regiments of the British Army into the Ukraine now is not strategic, it's tactical, because it's come with no background and no hinterland of decision making. And it's also incredibly stupid and incredibly dangerous, because either the Russians will target it or just try to work around it. But either way, you'll end up with British dead. So I do think we need to do more than just use the word strategy and then come up with a bunch of really questionable, in fact, incredibly dangerous and foolish short-term decisions, because we have to realize the world as it is. And the fact is that the Germans and the French won't support us with that, and neither would the Americans. So we would be out on our own. And the Russians, look, there is a specific problem with this country. The Russians would probably love to target us more than anyone apart from the United States, because they don't like the Anglo-Saxons and they view us very much as part of that world. And the US is closest ally. And if they can isolate us diplomatically and in security terms from the rest of Europe, and then pick a short and victorious war with us, I think Putin would see that.
I mean, no one's suggesting that we would go in alone, but the real question is whether or not NATO should be doing more. But
it's too late. It's too late for that. We need to think in, again, let's just drop the silly tactics and try to think strategically, please, about the longer term.
So, I mean, that's interesting, your thoughts about his big picture focus. Yeah. But I had Bill Browder on this show a couple of weeks back. He was talking about that much of the money that's in London is essentially being held here almost sort of on account of Putin by oligarchs, and that actually we should be freezing those assets like now, preemptively, from certain key individuals. Do you support that? Are you of that mind?
Yes, I am. I think Bill is a very sensible man. And again, another sort of, strategic failing is that Russia has come up with a very complex form of conflict. And it goes with a variety of names that I think can sound quite confusing: full spectrum, hybrid. This is the combination of military with non-military tools. And some of those tools are, money laundering, tax havens, the use of oligarchs to hide money from that belongs rightly or wrongly to the Russian regime. The front line in Ukraine goes along the border. The front line in Germany goes on gas pipelines. Yes. The front line in the UK goes through the city of London. And it's all very well us complaining about other people not guarding their front lines. We haven't guarded ours. And this is why we need a foreign lobbying act badly in this country, and we need to be getting ready to go after these people. But we should have done this, Richard, in 2014. That's the issue.
Absolutely. But as he said, actually we have got the equivalent of the Magnitsky Act here that we could be using. You touched there just finally, Bob, on the issue of gas, and of course Germany in particular, but far too much of continental Europe is so dependent on Russia's gas, and that's part of his big, in a sense, strategic advantage. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline, should we be saying to him, if he invades, then that would never be allowed, never be approved, never be certificated? Would that worry him or not?
Yes, I think it would. Look, there are two audiences that he is concerned with. I think he's concerned with the City of London a bit. But he thinks that Britain dislikes us because we are the most hawkish of the European powers. He can play the French off by sort of giving Macron this pretense of grandeur, and Macron and the French want their spheres of influence in the European Union, so he can play him like the fool he is. His real target actually is the Germans and the German business, the German-Russian business lobby, which is very powerful, but also the energy lobby as well. So we should absolutely be going after that. We should not allow Nord Stream 2 anyway, because if Russian gas has to go through Ukraine, it gives Ukraine levers over Russia.
Lots of it. Absolutely
so that's going to happen anyway.
Yeah, Bob, that's very interesting, and I think I completely support that actually he's very focused on the money, both here in the City of London and also with the gas pipeline to Germany. Bob Seeley, the Conservative MP for the Isle of Wight and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, thank you very much for those thoughts. Coming up after the top of the hour, we're going to be talking to Nick Buckley, MBE, about what's going on in Manchester and a waste of our cash. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Sunday Talk. Talk Radio.
Richard Tice, powered by Debate.
Sunday morning with the Tice Man.
Richard Tice.
The heart of a common sense Sunday.
Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We are into the second hour. It's still a bit grey and gloomy outside, and I think many residents in the great city of Manchester are also a bit grey and gloomy. But listen to this. Does this sound familiar? Where you have a referendum, there's a decisive result by the people in the referendum, and then over the subsequent years, guess what? Politicians and the establishment, well, they pretend they're going to listen to the referendum and then they start to undermine it. And then actually they try and do exactly the opposite. Yes, that's what happened with Brexit. And yes, once again, that's what's happening in Manchester. Because a number of years ago, there was a referendum about whether or not to have a car charging scheme in and around Greater Manchester. And over 70% of people, quite understandably, overwhelmingly, said thanks, but no thanks. And here we are, 2022, and the Greater Manchester Authority, under the leadership of Mayor Andy Burnham, re-elected last year, is now trying to impose a vehicle charging scheme, which they've sort of called a clean air zone charging scheme, that was due to come in May, which involves not just a few million quid, not just tens of millions of pounds, but potentially hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' cash. Just unbelievable what is going on. And now, because there's been a bit of a little bit of sort of a pushback from the great citizens of the Greater Manchester area, Andy Burnham all of a sudden is trying to push back, and he's delaying it until July, I think. So joining me to discuss this further, what I think is a scandalous waste of taxpayers' cash, is Nick Buckley, MBE, founder of the Mancunian Way charity. Nick, a very good morning to you. So just help my listeners and viewers a little bit. I've just sort of set the scene there, but we've got this this clean air zone charging scheme, which is supposed to be imposed, but now is going to be delayed. What's going on, and who does this apply to, and what sort of cost are we really talking about here?
So they've changed the name from a congestion charge to a clean air zone, because who in their right mind is against clean air? So there's some PR spinning on that front. I first heard about this January last year, and I'm quite politically aware. And if I only found out about it January last year, and the public consultation had already finished. It had been 7 weeks, under 5,000 people responded, and that's all the democratic will they need now to overturn the referendum. So as opposed to a normal congestion charge, where that's all vehicles, this is for commercial vehicles only. And the area it covers is the whole of Greater Manchester. Half of Manchester is lovely fields and countryside, but it affects them as well. So at the moment, we're looking at something like £7.50 a day for taxis. Small vans are a tenner. Then, depending on the size of your van, it goes up. And HGVs are something like £120 a day. And some people have said to me, well, I don't have a business, so I'm fine. Well, all your deliveries to your supermarket will incur this charge. All your Amazon deliveries, everything you pay will have to go up because people have to pay for this charge.
And is this for all vehicles, or just vehicles of a certain age with emission levels above a certain level?
It's nothing to do with age of the vehicle. There's a huge list of which vehicles this applies to. And it's basically 99% of vehicles, of commercial vehicles, apply.
Okay, so it's commercial vehicles. But of course, that actually is then essentially targeting the private sector, the self-employed, the small businesses, private businesses, the hard-working. And of course, I guess it doesn't affect public sector workers or public sector quangos and institutions.
It doesn't, but it'll affect the council taxpayer of those areas, because they're going to have to pay extra money to change those vehicles that belong to the council.
Okay, and of course, all of this is based on, you talked about the clean air, and that essentially it was believed that the Greater Manchester area didn't meet the EU levels for clean air, for the emission levels and the like. But also, I gather from reading up on it that much of this was based on not real data, but modelling. And we've all learnt a lot about government modelling and the quality of it and the reliability of it in recent months and years, haven't we?
Yes, so I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding of this is it was based on 2018 data, and then they used computer modelling to predict the level of pollution going forward. And you're right to say we've now learned that computer modelling can be a complete waste of time, just that has been with the COVID, millions and millions of deaths that were predicted. So modelling itself isn't concrete, and we're basing this on 4-year-old data and computers.
And of course, with COVID, actually traffic levels in cities has dramatically reduced. So it may well be that the real data, also in terms of emissions, in terms of air quality, that actually the emissions has reduced and the air quality has improved. And Andy Burnham has sort of said, as soon as the levels meet the required criteria, then the scheme would be stopped. So how much money are we talking about here, Nick? And therefore, would that money all potentially be wasted if we suddenly met the target 6-12 months down the track?
Yeah, so Andy Burnham is saying the scheme will stop and be scrapped the day we hit the targets. Now, we have to look at how much this scheme costs. And it's quite complicated, and the government never like to tell you exactly how much things cost. They're open. And some information is out there. So again, the information I found, let me read this. So information I found on a government report, this isn't on Facebook, this is a government report, states for Greater Manchester, the project funding, that's to install the cameras and the signs, we're looking at £250 million.
250 million quid of taxpayers' money to stick up some cameras and a few signs?
Yeah, up to 800 cameras. And then on top of this isn't the final figure, and on top of this, we're looking at an extra 220 million to implement the scheme, to give some people subsidies, to do this, to do that. And that's almost another $250 million. That's nearly a B, not an M, a B, £250 million.
That's utterly mind-boggling. I think we're all in the wrong business. We should be in the installation of CCTV camera business in Greater Manchester. So presumably some contracts have already been placed. But if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is that potentially hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds of money could be spent, and yet if 6 or 12 months later Greater Manchester meets the targets, then the scheme would stop.
That's what we're being told. Now, this money, let's be honest, this scheme was supposed to start in 3 months' time. Those contracts would have been signed a year or two ago. A lot of this money has been spent or has been contracted to be spent. No matter what happens now, the waste of money is tremendous.
I just find it utterly mind-boggling that these sums could be spent or potentially spent. So Andy Burnham's obviously in a bit of a pickle on this. He's delayed the scheme theoretically until July and is now trying to sort of shift the blame, I gather, back to the government. What's the real position?
This is pure politics. I stood against Andy Burnham last May for the Mayor of Greater Manchester, and Andy Burnham was re-elected on a bigger majority. He did excellent at that election. He got more people voting for him. It was a validation for Andy Burnham. But every hustings I went to and I confronted him about this, 100% behind it. He was telling us there's no option, this is a great scheme. Same with the Lib Dems, same with the Greens. And they all wanted this scheme. It's his scheme. The government said to Greater Manchester, your pollution is high. Tell us what you're going to do to reduce it. And they came up with this scheme. This scheme wasn't imposed on Greater Manchester. It's his scheme. And all of a sudden, nobody cared about it last year. Nobody understood it. But once the signs started going up in January saying this scheme is coming, people started asking questions. And all of a sudden, this tsunami of inquiries hit Andy Burnham, and everybody was saying, no, 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 no. And he's realised, this is my career going down the pan, this.
Well, that's right. Obviously, there's millions of voters in and around Manchester and Greater Manchester. And so he's delayed it until July. Is it possible that actually it may never get introduced, despite the fact that obviously large contracts have already been placed?
That's what I'm fighting for. And there's a group out there called Rethink GM, the Clean Air Zone. Join that group if you want to get involved in this. It's a non-party political group, and we're trying to get it scrapped. But even when we get it scrapped, someone needs to be held accountable for the millions that have been wasted on this. Now, what I found out 2 days ago, this will surprise some of your viewers. If you live in Wigan or Rochdale, the government never said your air was polluted. Your councils volunteered to join this scheme. At least the other 8 councils can say, well, we have to do something about pollution. Wigan and Rochdale, you joined because your council wanted you to spend more money.
I can't believe it. Nick Buckley, thank you so much for those thoughts. That was Nick Buckley live from Manchester regarding the clean air scheme that Andy Burnham's got himself in a right pickle on, where they are potentially wasting hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' cash. Give us a call, 0344 499 1000, particularly if you come from that area with your views on that scheme. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio. 21st century debate.
Speak once, think twice.
Talk Radio.
Exhalation, conversation, confrontation.
Plain talking, common sense.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We're well into the second hour. Coming up later in this hour, we're going to be talking to Christina Lamb, the foreign correspondent for The Times, about the crisis, the famine crisis, potentially catastrophic famine in Afghanistan 6 months on after the West essentially left Afghanistan. That is incredibly serious. But meanwhile, we've got some great tweets who've come in. Paul says, Bob Seeley talks so much sense about Putin's agenda. Unfortunately, most of his Conservative MPs, colleagues, don't take his view and have their heads in the sand. And that discussion we've just had about what's going on up in Greater Manchester, well, I mean, I just hate waste of money, particularly taxpayers' cash. The idea that, and particularly after a referendum said thanks but no thanks, but the idea that they could spend hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' cash, and it's not just Greater Manchester citizens, but also all of our cash, on a bunch of cameras, a bit of software, a few other bits, and then some monitoring of this contract based on modelling. Seriously? Hundreds of millions of pounds wasted based on modelling, and then the Mayor of Manchester says, if we reach the new target, then actually we can stop the scheme, even though they don't actually know whether or not, because of COVID and the reduction in traffic levels and the improvement in filters and improvement in emissions from cars, they might have already reached it. Unbelievable. If you're in Manchester or living in Manchester or travelling to Manchester and would be a victim of that scheme, give us a call, 0344 499 1000. I think we've got Mark, who's not from Manchester but from Bristol, on the line. Good morning, Mark. What are your thoughts this morning?
Good morning, Richard. Nice to speak to you. And just so you know where I'm coming from, I will be voting Reform in the next election.
Oh, so, bless you. Thank you. So what would you like to say this morning to my listeners?
Right, the same is happening in Bristol as Manchester.
Is it?
We have, yes. Well, I mean, it's amazing that mainstream media haven't told anyone. Weird thing, what's the connection between London, Bristol and Manchester? They all have left-wing screaming mayors, and consequently, the taxpayers are all suffering for it. The congestion zone is coming into Bristol next year. He's already, Marvin Rees, the mayor, has already completely and utterly messed up all the businesses in Bristol, because under the lockdown, he brought in, under a temporary traffic order, he closed off Bristol Bridge, which is a major junction within the centre of Bristol, and also Baldwin Street, so that everyone's forced to go around the inner ring road. He then, on certain sections of the inner ring road, introduced extra cycle lanes along the purpose-built cycle lanes.
This sounds hideously familiar to London. So the net result is traffic's worse and emissions are worse. Is that right?
Around the inner ring road, that's where he's moved all the pollution to, yes. But he's blocked it all under a temporary traffic order, and until it was signed off to say, oh yeah, we think this is brilliant, there are things happening. He actually spent thousands of pounds worth of money at changing the furniture, the signs, road signs, pavements and everything, even though it was all done under a temporary traffic order.
So you've got a clean air zone coming in 2023, have you, Mark?
Yes.
With a sort of charging scheme for private vehicles, for vans and the like?
Well, the charging scheme is already, if everyone goes to Bristol City Council's website, you'll see where it is. It encompasses not only the centre of Bristol, but hundreds of thousands of businesses as well, obviously. And if you know Bristol at all, it all goes all the way down the Portway, which is a major road into Bristol, and nowhere near the centre of Bristol, funnily enough. But yes, everyone's going to have to pay a charge to go into the centre of Bristol. More importantly, what he's done to the centre of Bristol, the Baldwin Street and Bristol Bridge, literally the only thing that can go over those major roads are taxis, motorbikes and bicycles, nothing else.
Unbelievable. Well, Mark, keep us informed about what's going on with the Bristol Clean Air Zone scheme. And listeners, if any of you anywhere have got any other experience of towns and cities that are bringing in these congestion charging schemes, look into it and let us know, because actually we need to know whether or not this makes sense, or is it based on dodgy modelling, out-of-date modelling, and actually it's just a huge waste of our cash, our money, our hard-earned money in the private sector. I want to know, because I feel that something terribly wrong is going on here. Thanks very much for that, Mark. We've got Gary in Scotland. Good morning, Gary.
Hi, good morning.
So what would you like to say? Is someone wasting a load of your cash in Scotland?
Someone wasting? No, we've got a very good economy up here, thank you. So we're all right. But no, I wanted to talk briefly about the Ukraine. I lived in Russia. I'm married to someone who's half Russian, half Ukrainian. So I just wanted to talk a wee bit about that. If that's
Great. No, go for it. Please let us know your thoughts.
Yeah, I think the current dialogue is really worrying people. I think, people are really worried there's going to be an all-out war. But I just want to remind people that what would Russia really achieve by invading Ukraine? I think Russia's playing the sort of 18th century European political chess, the big game, as they used to call it. It's got a large army. I think Putin needs to show his strength, but I think he and his cronies personally have too much to lose to risk all-out war. Ukraine's got a really weak economy. I think it'd be a big humanitarian crisis. And I think people forget as well, there is a lot of Russians living in the Ukraine. I've been to Kiev several times. I've never spoken Ukrainian. It's always been Russian.
Interesting. No, there's no question. I mean, it would be a bloodbath. It would be an absolute tragic humanitarian crisis. And I think I may be with you. I'm not sure he wants to invade Ukraine. I think a lot of this is about, as you say, sort of playing the big chessboard, reminding everyone else around the world that actually he should have a place at the top table. And it seems to me he does want the Nord Stream 2 pipeline open. He clearly doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO. I guess the question is, Bob Seeley's view, I think you probably heard there, Gary, his view is that having moved his troops and equipment and logistics to the Ukrainian border, there'll be a sort of loss of face if he didn't actually invade. You probably, it sounds as though you don't share that view.
No, I mean, he's got a big army. He needs to use it somehow, but I don't think he's actually going to. I don't think it would be a loss of face. He's doing it for the chess. But I don't think the dialogue in the West is really helping. I don't think, what the US is saying now is really helping, that there's going to be a war on Wednesday. I think that's almost goading people into war. And I think Johnson and Truss really need to up their game. I've seen Russian TV, and they're just seen as clowns.
Okay, so when you say they up their game, what do you think they should be doing that they're not doing?
Well, presenting themselves properly would be a start.
Yeah, combing his hair would be a good start.
But knowing where the Baltic is and the Black Sea would be a start. But they need to, I think, present a lot firmer. Russia respects strength.
Yes.
And I think they also need to think, well, what does actually Russia want? What's the exit ramp here? Just saying we're sending more troops to the border isn't going to help. Let's think about what we want, what Russia wants, and what's the exit ramp.
But when you say show more strength, short of sending a division to NATO, sending a division to Ukraine, what more do you think that the West and here in the UK, Truss and Johnson should have said and done that they haven't done?
Again, that's laughable, right? Seeing pictures of 20 British troops on the Polish border isn't going to put off.
No, sure. I'm not talking about that.
Division,
I mean, Tobias Ellwood's talking about sending a whole NATO division, but I don't think many people support that idea. But you talked about showing more strength.
Yeah,
I'm just interested in what strength.
Concrete and be absolutely clear what the economic sanctions are. Don't just threaten, it might be really difficult for Russia in the future if you invade. Well, say what the actual sanctions would be. Let them mull it over.
Be more specific. And would you... I think you're right, actually. And you may have heard Bill Browder talk about it a couple of weeks back in terms of specific individuals. So would you impose any sanctions preemptively ahead, or just ratchet up the temperature on the sanctions?
If it helps in the negotiations, and then yes, but I don't think imposing the sanctions now... I actually think that the US actually did impose some kinds of sanctions on Friday. I might be wrong, but I think they actually are turning up the heat slightly. But I think, as I say, you've got to give them an exit ramp and think about what's in Putin's head as well.
Yes, and it feels to me that he really wants this pipeline, this direct pipeline that's been built and is ready to go, but has not yet been approved, Nord Stream 2, to be opened. So that because of course that means he can undermine the Ukrainian economy even more, because they'd lose more transit fees through the Ukrainian pipelines. That seems like a key objective.
Yeah, and just geopolitically, I mean, from a Russian perspective, wanting to get closer links with China as well, and that's very much on their news at the moment. And I think the MP, he mentioned that Russia hates Anglo-Saxons. I don't think that's true. What they don't like is the kind of extreme American capitalism and how they were exploited in the 90s by US firms.
Indeed.
And I think what they don't like as well is being put in a corner.
That is for sure. Gary, I don't think he does like being put in a corner. Who knows? Thank you very much. That's Gary in Lithgow in Scotland. I hope I pronounced that right, with his thoughts on Putin's objectives. Coming up after the bottom of the hour in the news, we're going to be talking to Christina Lamb about the horrendous famine that is descending upon Afghanistan. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
World headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio. Listen on DAB+.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice, Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. It's just after 11:30 and some great tweets and messages coming through here. We've got one here which is, hi Richard, if we continue to just recruit graduates to public service bodies, then the chances are they will be left-wing. Interesting thought there, that text message. Another one here from Bob in Oldham who says, I'd like to know what each of the councils get out of the clean air changes, and no wonder they're all up for it. Perhaps they should just put a ring road round Manchester and charge for entry. Well, of course, Oldham is one of the areas that would be included within the Greater Manchester Clean Air Zone scheme. And these schemes are definitely being introduced across the country. And I want to hear from you if you're in an area where this is the case. Because my concern is that it's all about the modelling. And there's a message here from William who says, bearing in mind the government's been chasing local authorities to clean up air quality to reach EU standards. Some cases are still going through EU courts. Local authorities love these clean air zone schemes called CAS schemes because the government pays for them. Well, the reality is it's not the government who pays for them, it's us. It's our money. And the government has pushed them through. This is a massive political game, and it seems like we have a huge waste of taxpayers' cash. Now, I'm hoping that we've got my next guest lined up, but I'm being waved at by my production team that says that Christina Lamb is not yet ready for us. But we want to move away from Ukraine. And the impact, of course, of Ukraine is it's distracted Western leaders from what's going on in Afghanistan. And in a sense, the risk of war is so significant that everybody's focusing on that. But it's 6 months since we left Afghanistan in that desperate evacuation. And here we are, the consequences of it, going through a cold winter. Money has been frozen in terms of all of the assets that Afghanistan has in bank accounts. That's been frozen, so almost $10 billion. And the Taliban, now in control of Afghanistan, essentially, they're now controlling the economy. But the reality is that there is a desperate shortage of food. And Christina Lamb, who's the chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times, has recently been out to Afghanistan, incredibly experienced foreign correspondent. And the headline that she wrote, which really struck with me, was that it was the worst she had seen for 35 years. And she's now with us on the line. Christina, very good morning. Thank you for joining us. I've just sort of been setting the scene of the crisis that's emerging in terms of famine and the distraction of Western leaders, obviously, on Ukraine. You wrote a very powerful piece just a couple of weeks ago, which really hit home, it feels. You know, the idea of fathers having to sell one daughter in order to pay for food for the rest of the family just is unthinkable to all of us lucky enough to be here in the West. Just interested your thoughts on this and just how bad it is.
Yeah, good morning, Richard. It's really desperate, the situation. I mean, the fact, as you just talked about, that people are so hungry that the only way they can survive is to sell their children, or there's also been reports of people selling their kidneys, I think brings home to people just how bad it is. One of the families I went to had sold their 8-year-old daughter, Fatima, a few months ago. But actually, the day that I went to see them, they had tried to sell their 3-month-old daughter as well, because the situation was so bad. I mean, this was Afghanistan. People live in these extended families. This is a family of about 30 people. And the only aid they were getting were 8 pieces of bread a day.
I mean, just horrendous. And the quantity, I mean, it's hard to imagine being driven to that level of despair and fear. Just impossible for all of us. But the quantity of people, I mean, Afghanistan is 40 million people, give or take. And I think you wrote that about 23 million people may be at risk of famine. And potentially 1 million children might die of hunger.
Yeah, I mean, already the UN is saying 97% of people are not getting enough to eat. And it's hard to just describe. It's that you've got this sort of combination of factors. So you haven't just got, there's a terrible drought, which is the worst drought in 40 years. And many places the harvest has completely failed. There's nothing. But on top of that, you've got a really, really bitter winter. In Kabul, when I was there, it was -16 some days. And people don't have money for fuel to heat their homes. And then on top of that, you're looking at a country which has gone through 40 years of war, so it's already very precarious. There's lots of widows, there's lots of people who've suffered injuries. And then when the Taliban took over 6 months ago, and all the foreign troops and foreign NGOs and foreign organizations and embassies left, all the jobs went, and also 75% of the Afghan budget came from foreign aid. So you had this complete economic implosion. Also, the country's assets have been frozen, so the banking system isn't working. So people either don't have jobs because everything has collapsed, or if they're still working, usually in government jobs, they haven't been paid for 5 or 6 months.
And so you've got a complete economic collapse, and therefore, essentially, there's no money flowing. And I guess it would be easy to say, well, if the Western nations didn't freeze the Afghanistan's government's assets in banks, then they'd have money to pay for food. But is it as simple as that? And could the Taliban actually be trusted to spend that cash on food, or would the money disappear through corruption? We know that Afghanistan had sort of legendary levels of corruption. And in a sense, how much does the Taliban leadership really care, or have they been caught out by the depth of this crisis?
I think it's a combination. I mean, a lot of the Taliban that you speak to will say, well, Allah will provide. And they will also say, we have spent the last 20 years living in the mountains, subsisting on hardly anything, and kind of what are people complaining about? Others also say that they're shocked at what they've discovered when they came to Kabul, because they thought that all this money that had been poured into Afghanistan, about $1 trillion over the last 20 years, would have left the country in a better state than it is in. And, to be fair, they have a point, but the big problem at the moment, as you're really pointing out, nobody wants to deal with the Taliban. It's very unpalatable. It's a government that's taken power by force, that is trying to take the country back sort of 1400 years in many ways. I would say the majority of Afghans, not all Afghans, but majority of Afghans, particularly women and particularly urban areas, are very unhappy about what's happened. But what we're doing at the moment by withholding the assets is really punishing the people that are suffering, not the Taliban leadership, but the very people that we said we wanted to help. I mean, how is it helping anybody in Afghanistan by letting women and children starve? I find that extremely difficult.
No, that's right. I mean, clearly it's not. I guess the question is, does the Taliban leadership care? If large quantities of food were provided by NGOs and things, would it get distributed? Do they really care about it, or in some hideous, perverse way, does this situation sort of strengthen their leadership?
Well, the Taliban is not monolithic, so there are different factions. Some factions, I would say, that are more, what we would say, moderate, do definitely care very much about feeding the people, and I really want help. I want international recognition. There is another side that's much more hardline that will say, we fought this for Islam, and the way that the West is treating us just shows that we shouldn't be dealing with them anyway. And so in a way, by not engaging, we are empowering the more hardline. It's very tricky. I mean, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should recognize the Taliban. I don't think that we should do that. But I do think we have to engage with them, because the country is in a desperate state. And the only way to help is to get aid in.
And which Western countries are sort of essentially at the forefront, or in any way engaging with the Taliban leadership to try and find a way through this complex situation? Are we involved, or is it are others ahead of us on this?
Yeah, I mean, there are foreign NGOs on the ground, so organisations from the UN, Save the Children, Afghan Aid, British organisations are on the ground trying to help people, but they have limited resources at the moment. There have been some meetings, so this week in Geneva, a couple of weeks ago in Oslo, between Taliban officials and international representatives, and there have been some trips from British officials in Doha into Afghanistan. So there are talks going on, but it's not really clear that they're achieving very much so far.
Interesting. Christina, thank you so much for those thoughts. That's Christina Lamb, the chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times, with her thoughts and experiences of the catastrophic famine that is descending upon millions and millions of people in Afghanistan, fears that potentially 1 million children could die of hunger. And clearly, Western leaders are distracted by what's going on in Ukraine and the consequences of that, and that rushed evacuation now, 6 months later, really beginning to be seen. And clearly something does need to be done. Keep those calls coming in 0344 499 1000. We'll take them after the break. It's Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Radio.
The home of common sense.
Permanent, persuasive, profound. The machine code of modern thinking.
Now with 0% drift and dither.
Radio with an answer for everything.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. It's still grey and gloomy outside, but I'm delighted that someone has helped me with the pronunciation of Linlith Go. Thank you for that text message. And then we're going to go to your calls. We've got Chris, who is in South Manchester. Chris, a very good morning. So, you probably are in this clean air zone. Is that what you're ringing to call about?
Yeah, that's correct, Richard. So let me just give you a bit of a background on myself. So I'm a small family-run haulier business in the south of Manchester. And when I say we're small, I mean, before this clean air tax was coming in, I had 2 trucks and that was it. And I had a number of members of staff, and I drove one truck and the other member of staff drove a truck. So when this clean air tax was coming in, firstly I had to get rid of my other vehicle because I knew I was going to have to buy a compliant vehicle, which I couldn't afford at the time. So yeah, it's
it's already hit you pretty hard, and that you've had to downsize your business.
Yeah, and like I said, my business is it was already small, you know, and we haven't got thousands of pounds in the bank. We live for the now.
Well, that's why I said it's going to hit the least well off and the small business owners, the doers, the SMEs the hardest. And is there any form of government funding or scrappage scheme to help you with that?
Yeah, the government are issuing grants, and this brings me on to the next problem that I had. So when the Clean Air Zone was being arranged and the website first came out, I was kind of following the website. So basically, just to read what was going on. So obviously to keep trading, because I didn't have the compliant vehicles, me and my wife had a discussion where we're like, well, we're going to have to sell one of the vehicles and let the other member of staff go, because we won't be able to afford to replace both vehicles to compliance. So one of the hardest things I had to do was let
I can imagine, and presumably you've got friends in similar situations. Working hard in the private sector who must be going through similar sort of thought process. Definitely. So, like I was saying, one of the hardest things I had to do is let the member of staff go. But look, and it was just before Christmas, this as well. I know. I mean, my heart goes out to you. And so, to what extent is this now the sort of the talk of the city and the broader area in terms of self-employed, small business owners, taxi drivers? I mean, it just feels to me that this is, it's absolutely seismic. Andy Burnham has delayed it, but have you joined one of these campaigns like Rethink to see if you could actually get the whole thing stopped?
I'm on Rethink. I put a video on Rethink about of the situation that I was in, and that's what I was getting at to you. So I applied for government funding. So basically, I looked for a compliant vehicle, went to a fantastic family-run truck dealership. They helped me out. They give me a vehicle. They sorted me out a vehicle. I put a deposit down of £10,000 on that vehicle. So I was waiting for my government grant. I didn't want to pay. I didn't want to pay for it all there and then because I needed the grant, to help me out as well. So the vehicle that I've bought has cost me £47,000. The government are only offering me £7,000 grant. So okay, it's what it is, So
you've got to shell out 40 grand.
So I had to find the other 40 grand, which I've had to get into debt for some of it as well.
So you're being forced into debt. You're being forced to buy a new vehicle for a scheme where actually it doesn't appear that they've updated the data since COVID, and actually the emission levels may have fallen because of the reduction in travel. A lot of this is based on modelling. Well, we all know what we think about modelling, given the last couple of years.
Absolutely.
And you've got a mayor of Manchester who said that he might stop the whole scheme a few months after it starts if the latest readings show that we've now met the new levels. I mean, you're being forced into debt and to waste your cash on a scheme of madness.
If anyone who believes that he's going to turn that off, if it falls to a certain level, you'll believe anything.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I get the point.
If that was the case, they would have turned the one off in London, wouldn't they?
Well, that's another very good point. Chris in Manchester, thank you so much for those thoughts. Anyone else who's a victim of these mad clean air zone schemes, whether it's in Manchester or anywhere else, I want to hear about it. I want to talk about it, because it feels to me that the private sector, hard-working folk, are being ripped off, are being scammed of their cash by incompetent bureaucrats. Meanwhile, Kim is down in Kent. Hello, Kim.
Hello, Richard. How are you?
Well, I'm a bit cross about bureaucrats wasting our cash, but apart from that, what would you like to say, Kim?
I'm permanently cross about that. I want to pick up on something that somebody said earlier. They sent you a comment about a woke test for candidates for the leadership of the Metropolitan Police.
Oh, yes.
I completely agree, because what we need to do is weed out common purpose. I mean, she is common purpose. Everyone knows that. It's a well-known fact that Cressida Dick is common purpose. And it's an organisation, as you know. It's infested universities. It's gone all the way across the private and public sector. And these people are, quite frankly, a nuisance.
Help my listeners with common purpose.
It's an organisation. It was set up to put people in universities and various organisations, I personally think it's something that's straight out of the Frankfurt School and Coudenhove-Kalergi. But, what they are is basically woke. They are there to tell everybody what to do, what to think, how to do things, how not to do things. And it's been very prevalent all throughout the COVID crisis. We've had the woke popping up everywhere, telling us what statues we can worship and which ones we can't, which ones should be removed, knocked down, thrown into rivers. They're everywhere, these people, and they're insane, and they need to be removed. Well, her principles are, oh, okay, well, this is how we're going to do policing. Let's go and paint a few police cars with rainbows. Well, I've got nothing against gay people. I've got gay friends. Even they think it's ludicrous.
Oh, I mean, it seems to have infected. I think you've hit it on the head. It does seem to have infected the universities, academics, and then people also being appointed to very highly paid roles for sort of diversity and inclusion managers. Again, wasting our cash. It is a real concern. Thank you very much, Kim, for that thought about people who end up in positions of leadership in the public sector. And I think it concerns us all. I think we've got time for one more call before we hit the top of the hour. Jim is in Gateshead. Hello, Jim.
Yeah, how are you, Richard?
Well, I'm a bit frustrated this morning, to be honest, Jim, about some of this, what's going on with our bureaucrats. But maybe you'll tell me that all is sweetness and light in sunny Gateshead.
It always is. Yeah, but the thing is, I was on your research about the Ukraine thing, and me being like a printer and not having a brain according to people at the top, is I watched in 1990 as the Berlin Wall come down, and I watched the transport with jobs to the east to bring them up. Then I thought, this is dangerous. Russia isn't going to like this as we expanded east. Then I watched we're manufacturing it be sent to China to make China rich. And I'm thinking, why we're making them rich when they actually detest the West? Both Russia and China detest the West, and I can see it. It is the push towards the Ukraine earlier in the early 2010s and such like. I thought, this is going to lead to war. This is basically what happened in the First World War and the Second World War. We're pressing them, we're provoking them, and all the rest of it. And if I can see that as a working man, I don't know why they can't see it. The people at the top that should know better. And ultimately, what we've done is we've made Russia rich through the energy problem, and we've made China rich through outsourcing manufacturing. And like Karl Marx said, not that I'm a communist, the capitalist will sell you the rope that you'll hang them with. And that's what we've done. The West has hung itself for cheap produce, and now we're paying the price because we've made China rich, and Russia controls our economy basically because they control our power.
Well, exactly. They control the energy. And the mad thing is, absolutely mad thing is, Jim, that we've got the power. I'm going to be talking about it shortly, about shale gas. I've touched on it before, and I'm going to keep banging on about this because we've got the power here in the UK, actually elsewhere in continental Europe. They've got the power. They just elected not to use it and to actually expose themselves and make themselves vulnerable to Russia, and it is complete madness. Jim, thank you so much for those thoughts. Keep those calls coming in. We've got lots of tweets coming in about the clean air zone. Here's good news. One from Decentralised Dog, interesting. Fortunately, the Leeds clean air zone was axed, apparently because it would have been illegal. Well, I hope that's the case. That sounds like good news. That sounds like actually some common sense prevailed. I'd be interested to know what caused the bureaucrats to axe it. That will be absolutely fascinating. Keep those tweets and information coming in. We want to know. We want to stop taxpayers' hard-earned cash being wasted by bungling bureaucrats. After the top of the hour, we're going to be talking to Francis Egan, the chief executive of Quadrilla, who started to explore and extract shale gas, but then was stopped by the government and the eco-zealots. It's Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Mid-morning talk.
Sunday talk.
Talk Radio.
Take a chance with the Tice Man.
Talk Radio.
Richard Tice.
Sunday morning devotion, there isn't a sermon.
Talk Radio's Common Sense Weekend.
Richard Tice.
On Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We have flown into the third and final hour. It's good afternoon, no longer is it good morning. And we've had lots of calls, lots of tweets and messages and some fascinating discussions so far. Great message here from Sonia, who says the only university our police recruits need to go to is the University of Life. It's the same as nurses in the NHS. I trained on the wards on the job 30 years ago. As soon as nurses had to get a diploma, you get a different type of nurse, a career nurse. Too many layers of management in both the NHS and the police. Need to get back to basics. I think Sonia's right. I think actually much of that is about just basic common sense. And talking of common sense, you may have listened to me over the recent weeks talking about the treasure under our feet. And it feels to me, simple common sense, that if you've got a pile of very valuable treasure under your feet, I use the example of being in the cellar of a house that you've just inherited. Some bright spark has blocked up access to the cellar, and you need to find a way to access it because the value of that treasure under our feet in your cellar, it's like half the mortgage on your house. Just imagine, if you get that treasure out, you can clear off half your mortgage. And likewise, the value of the treasure, the shale gas, under our feet in the north of England, across parts of the UK. The value of that treasure is in the order of half the national debt. And yet our politicians, in their wisdom, have decided to leave it there. And instead, they're going to send our money and our jobs to Russia. Well, we know how Putin behaves, don't we? Or they're going to send it to China, or we're going to buy electricity from France, or LNG from the Middle East, when we've got this gas here in the UK. Well, I'm delighted now to be joined by Francis Egan, who's the chief executive of Quadrilla Resources. That was the first company with a license to start trying to extract shale gas. But unfortunately, the eco-zealots, the eco-bullies, they got in the way, and one thing led to another, and we ended up with a moratorium from the politicians who had previously promised to allow this whole industry to develop and create jobs and to extract our natural resource, and then they bottled it and put a moratorium on. Francis, a very good afternoon to you. So I saw you've written a great piece in today's Sunday Telegraph on the madness that not only were you stopped, and you've spent huge sums of money on drilling these wells, being ready to access this treasure under our feet, but now a bunch of bright sparks and bureaucrats are telling you you've got to spend millions more filling it with cement. What's going on?
Yes, I know. You could hardly make it up, could you? Good morning, good afternoon even. You're quite right. We've spent hundreds of millions of pounds demonstrating that we have indeed a huge treasure under our feet right across the north of England. Trillions of cubic feet of natural gas. And to put that in context, the country uses about 3 trillion cubic feet of gas per year. And we've shown that with a fairly modest recovery, if you could just get 10%, 1/10 of what's under the ground out, we have enough gas to keep us all going for about 50 years. So it's not a small prize; it's a huge prize. But now we've not only been stopped, but we've been told we have to spend our own money filling the wells that we've drilled full of cement, which beggars belief, I have to say.
What's the advantage of filling it with cement rather than just leaving them there? In terms of other developments that may come, whether it's a refined form of fracking or whether it's from the other technologies, why would you fill up a perfectly good drilled well?
Well, I really wish I could answer that question, and you're absolutely right. Man, even if the government, even if they didn't want to end the moratorium now, which everyone is saying they should do, well, you would retain the wells. It provides you with a low-cost option to re-enter the shale rock. And as you say, other technologies, if they don't like fracking, and I have no reason to understand why they wouldn't, but if they don't, other technologies might emerge and they find a way of doing it, and you don't have to drill the wells again. If you fill them full of cement and take away all the pipe work, they're in effect useless. It makes no sense whatsoever. I think, as you say, some bright spark has had a bad day at the office.
It's more than a bad day. And I just want to touch on this issue of viability, because your business has spent, as you say, hundreds of millions of pounds. It has been suggested by some people that it's not viable to extract shale gas here in the UK. And that's the reason that actually it's not being progressed. What's your answer to that?
Well, I think the people who are suggesting that, frankly, are making it a self-fulfilling prophecy. I've heard, various government insiders or government spokespeople who don't seem to want to be named saying it will take 10 years to develop this. Well, if you drown the industry in red tape, most of it inherited from European Union regulations that we no longer have to follow, then it could take 10 or 20 years. If you get behind the industry, allow it to progress safely. I'm not saying that, it should be a cowboy industry, by no means are we. Then we could have gas flowing within a year and in relatively small quantities, and serious volumes of gas flowing within 3 to 4 years right across the country, not just from Quadrilla. There are plenty of other companies, INEOS, a very large company with lots of interest here in the UK, has also invested a lot of money in this and is prepared to invest more. So I think that is frankly just an excuse that's put out there.
It sounds like it to me, because you and your shareholders are not going to waste your money, and likewise the likes of INEOS, which is obviously a major multinational corporation, they don't want to waste their money either. Now, I've touched on before about new technologies. You just touched on it then, because in a sense, nothing ever stands still. Engineers, creative designers, they come up with new ways of doing things. And this is the case here in the drilling industry, in the gas industry, and indeed in shale gas. So it's another reason, surely, to keep all the options open, because there are other technologies out there other than fracking.
Well, of course, and I think that's the fatal flaw at the heart of our energy policy is it doesn't create sufficient options, and it never stays the course. I've been in this job for 10 years, and in that period of time, I've dealt with 10 separate energy ministers. Now, energy investments, as you know, and I'm sure your listeners will know, typically are long-term investments. They take several years to come to fruition, but then they last for decades. The US shale gas industry was by no means, an overnight success. There was 10 years of development before they got any gas flowing, and much of that was funded by the US government, who saw the benefit in security of supply and now are reaping the...
We may have just lost Francis Egan, the chief exec of Quadrilla Resources, there in mid-flow, as he was talking about the benefit of potential new technologies, because nothing ever stands still. And it's like when they say follow the science. Well, science actually isn't just one course of action. You get different scientists with different views, and you get different engineers creating new technologies, brighter technologies, better ways of doing things. That's how, for example, the smartphones continue to get better and better, because engineers, they improve things, they make things happen, and they sort things out. We've got some other, just whilst we're waiting to get Francis back on the line, and we've got, I think we have now got Francis Egan back. Hi again, Francis. You were just cut off talking about the new technologies.
I think we lost power. Maybe there was a power cut. Yes, apologies. I was just saying, yes, and US gas prices are 6 times lower than European or UK prices.
And that, of course, is because they're using shale gas. So that puts to shame the complete myth that's being perpetrated by some senior politicians, saying that even if we had shale gas, the producers would be exposed to international markets, and it wouldn't make any difference to the price.
Well, it's dangerously wrong and complacent. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you prevent the gas getting produced, as in fact policy in Europe and the UK has done, well, don't be surprised when you have a deficit. If you allow the gas to be produced in the US, they actually have a surplus, and they are exporting their shale gas across the Atlantic to the UK and Europe, where we have plenty of our own but won't produce it. I mean, it's bordering on criminal negligence, that.
I think it is. We've got some great tweets coming in, Francis, just whilst you've been talking. Richie says, it makes no sense to Richie to leave this treasure untouched, like you said before. If it doesn't make sense, follow the money. Well, I think that is the point. And another observation here, talking about the fact there's more vibration from the construction of the HS2 train line than from fracking. Are you hopeful that with the potential for new technologies and growing pressure from parts of the Tory party, Francis, that actually we may just be at a sort of a tipping point of change, given what's happening to our energy prices and everybody being so aware of this issue?
Well, hopeful would probably be a little strong, but I'm encouraged by the support, certainly, of the public, as you've seen from your tweets, and certainly some politicians. But to put the vibration into context, you know, the tweet there is absolutely right. The whole shale gas industry in the UK, across the UK, has been shut down because of one 3-second tremor that was at half the level allowed in the construction industry. One tremor, half the level allowed in the construction industry for 3 seconds, and that has been used as a justification for saying we can't continue. Now, where's the science in that?
Well, I think what we learn from that is that that's not actually science. That is a very well-funded environmental lobbying group who have got they've got access to government, and they succeeded in terrifying politicians. It seems to me.
Look, it may well be. It may well be, but you know, there are certainly more tremors going on HS2. If we were to apply the same criteria, we'd probably shut down most of the tube network in London. We'd be shutting down train stations. We'd be shutting down quarries. We'd be shutting down construction.
Lots of other construction sites,
and pretty much everything else.
Madness. Well, Francis, we at the home of common sense. I'm going to keep talking about this, keep pushing for this, because I feel that there is a complete dislocation between what the public want, who I think actually want a referendum on the whole net zero agenda. I think the public would want shale gas to be extracted in a safe and efficient way, and that we should try it. And yet, actually, the politicians seem to want something completely different. We'll get you back to keep talking about this. Francis, thank you so much. That's Francis Egan, the Chief Executive of Quadrilla Resources. And shale gas is the treasure, and we need to find a way to get it out of the ground, because actually that will keep the money and the jobs and industry here in the UK, and it will cut all of our bills and the potential to create a sovereign wealth fund. Give us a call, 0344 499 1000. It's Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
The microeconomics of rational debate.
Arguments all round.
A radio station, not a panic station.
Translate and decode the issues of the moment.
Talk Radio.
Now available on TV.
Welcome back, my friends, to Tice Talk in this early afternoon. It's just about 20 past 12, the third and final hour of my show. And that was a great chat with Francis Egan, the chief exec of Quadrilla. And my goodness me, I think the vast majority of you agree with me and with Francis. Pete, he says, just when you thought the world couldn't get any madder, we're not going to extract shale gas from under our feet, but instead ship it in from lands far, far away, missing out on jobs, tax and control. That's quite right. What's even madder, some of the gas that we are shipping in is from America. And guess how they got that gas? Yes, they fracked it. So it's the same process that actually is being conducted safely in America, and we're now shipping it over here. So we're sending our money over there. It really is mad. Bob, he says, Boris wants to boast to be the greenest world-beating nation, avoiding the fact that we buy energy and goods from non-green countries, effectively outsourcing our non-greenness. Quite right, Bob. Let's listen to what Robert in London wants to say. Good afternoon, Robert. How are we doing? What would you like to say?
Good morning. Sorry, I just turned it off. Well, it's quite incredible. Are the government actually mad because clearly the outcomes are mad, or is it something else? You know, we keep being told what a terrible despot Putin is, and we know that the Chinese Communist Party engages some really disgusting activities. Is it beneath these people, do we think, to offer bribes to some of our politicians or academics to influence our policy? Because what is today's conspiracy theory might well turn out to be true. I cannot understand how we can sit on so much energy, gas, coal, the shale, like you're saying, and not be using it. Have people who are going to go hungry this winter in 2022.
It is complete madness, Robert. I think you used the word sort of bribe. I think what it is actually is it's much more subtle than that. What you do notice is a real trend of politicians that very often, and I'll talk about this in a later show, very often they get promoted after they've been an MP to the House of Lords, or very often they go and work for a quango or being vice-chancellor of a university that receives grants from China or from elsewhere. Yeah. Or say they're a non-exec director of a board, for example, a board of directors of a Russian company or a Chinese company or the subsidiary of a Chinese company based here in the UK, such as Huawei. That's actually what goes on. And so you've got parts of the British establishment that essentially they are taking Russian and Chinese money, and they're either fools or, frankly, they care more about their own bank balance than the good interests of the United Kingdom. That's the reality of what's actually going on.
What's actually happening. And so my question to you, Tim, and okay,
Richard, not Tim.
I understand. Sorry, but I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate the diplomacy that you're exuding there. But if you are making decisions that are suboptimal, because ultimately there's a paycheck involved, however you structure the transfer, if you're not acting in good faith, and that's what these people are supposed to do, that's why they get paid so much money, then, it is, it's semantics, but to me, it's still a bribe. And I'm really quite disgusted at what I've, just in the last 20 years in my life, 30 years, of watching British politics, of watching these illegal wars. We're about to go to war. They're rattling the sabre in Ukraine, aren't they? And, we all know that Joe Biden's son has got some really quite interesting business interests in Ukraine, or has had. And are we going to go to war to protect their family's integrity? I mean, come on.
I think hopefully we're not going to war, but let's remember, of course, it's not us that is actually that is pushing this situation. It's not us that has pushed tens of thousands of troops to the border of Ukraine. It's Putin. He's the one that's driving it. The challenge for us is how to respond to it. Robert, I need to move on, but thank you very much for those thoughts. That's Robert in London, questioning the madness and questioning the motives of some of the people in the establishment making some of the decisions. We're going to head now, I think, to South Wales, where Pete is. Good afternoon, Pete.
Good afternoon, Richard. How are you?
Well, I'm a bit frustrated today, but maybe you can cheer me up. Give me some good news, or maybe not.
Well, I'll give you some good news regarding the situation with fracking, and the good news is that the green people are going to get cold as well when their wind turbines don't turn and when the sun isn't shining, so that their solar panels won't work or they're covered in snow.
Yes, but Pete, of course, very often these green eco-zealots actually... they're the sort of the metropolitan middle class who are much wealthier and therefore much more able to pay these energy bills, as opposed to ordinary families, hard-working families who are not so wealthy, who find it much more of a struggle.
Yeah, and the other thing is I find it hard to believe that they can object to a hole being drilled that's a fraction of a human hair in width, and then walk around London with a tube underneath them and trains. With, God knows how big those tunnels are. Regarding the situation with the Metropolitan Police Cressida Dick,
Commissioner, yes, and the replacement, that's right.
I think the idea of bringing in somebody from outside of the police force is a wrong one. I served 32 years in the fire brigade, and that's already being done in the fire brigade. People are coming in literally from Tesco's or Marks and Spencer's, and suddenly telling people in the fire brigade who've done the job for years how to put fires out and what to do next. And it's causing a lot of problems. Let's not forget that there are people up and down the country who have studied for qualifications to become chief officers, and then to bring in somebody from the army, for example. They may have led people in the army, but they haven't led police officers. And if you or I went to hospital, we wouldn't want our surgeon to have come from QuickFit, would we?
No, it's an interesting point, and I get your experience there, but equally, I'm not talking about someone else coming in, a QuickFit mechanic coming to be a surgeon. What I'm talking about is someone with the managerial experience and wisdom to be able to know how to motivate a team to embark upon a sort of a change culture, and also, for example, to bring in new technology and just create a sense of accountability and performance. Whereas I worry that, in particular, from what I'm hearing about what goes on in police forces, is that too often it's just sort of people from within just perpetuating the same old attitudes.
Well, there are then people on the outside, such as public protection committees, whose overall responsibility it is to provide the service. And in my opinion, in the fire brigade, I can speak for, there's too many chiefs and not enough Indians anyway. We've had Cressida Dick, who is now gone. She's been paid for years. I think she should have gone a long time ago. I think there needs to be a lot more Indians and far fewer chiefs. And certainly the few chiefs that are needed should be people who have actually come up through the ranks. How they perform is a separate matter. But I think it's a bad idea to have, for example, an ex-Royal Navy or Army person.
I get that, Pete, but then I look at the track record. I mean, the reality is that, crime levels are on the up, knife crimes on the up, particularly here in London, and the percentage of crimes being solved is dramatically being cut. How long do we put up with bad performance before we say we've got to be prepared to have the courage to try something different? That's my big question, Pete.
Well, yeah, fair enough. But I mean, as I say, what you're going to do is cause resentment within the people that you've got. I think the best thing to do is find somebody capable of doing the job from within. And if you try them for, let's say, 6 months or whatever, 12 months, and they haven't made a good improvement, then you get rid of them. I mean, football clubs do it all the time.
Yes, they do indeed. Pete, I've got to move on, but thank you very much. That was Pete from South Wales with his thoughts. He doesn't agree with me that we should bring someone in from the outside of the Met Police Pete hopes that there is someone of sufficient quality from within, I think either from the Met or from another police force. Meanwhile, some great tweets coming in here. One here from Almost Braken. I agree with Richard on 99% of policy and ideas, but fracking is not the gold under the ground. Yes, we get frack gas from the USA, but they now have a contaminated water table. But let's remember that actually the fracking is not the gas itself. Fracking is the process of extraction. And the key point is it's the shale gas that's the gold. And if people are not happy with fracking, then let's look at the other technologies that are being developed that can extract the gas in a different way. And I think that is absolutely critical. So, for example, there are other technologies where you don't need chemicals and sand and water to be used in order to extract the gas. That's the key point. We've got to be prepared to try things. But thanks for the tweet. Coming up after the news, we're going to be talking to Jamie Jenkins, the independent statistician, about COVID restrictions. Is it right or wrong to lift them? Keep the calls coming in 0344 499 1000. It's Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
A first magnitude star of common sense.
The Tice Man.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. I cannot believe we have raced into the last half hour of the show. The tweets and the calls are pouring in. We've got one here from Tony. I like this, about the clean air zone in Manchester. Tony says, the reason Andy Burnham postponed the start date is because of the local elections in May. Too many people were promising to vote against all the Labour councils. That is very interesting. Tony could well be on to something there. That sounds like common sense. Well, a further aspect of common sense and proponent of common sense is the independent statistician and former head of health statistics at the ONS, Jamie Jenkins, who can give us a bit of a heads up on the latest data and information around COVID, because of course we've had the situation where the Prime Minister has, in my view, quite rightly brought forward the date to ease all the remaining COVID restrictions in England in advance of Wales and Scotland. He's had a bit of criticism from that, but he's also had quite a lot of support from many people, including those who otherwise might criticise him. Jamie, a very good afternoon to you. So here we are. We're potentially approaching the end of many of these COVID restrictions. And I think most people accepting that we're into the sort of the endemic phase of COVID as opposed to pandemic. Inevitably, of course, lots of people, scientists who seem to enjoy lockdowns, they're whinging and whining, I think more in the background. Give us a sense of some of the latest critical data that may have been helping the Prime Minister and his closest advisors to give them the confidence about that on matters like excess deaths and things.
Yeah, afternoon, Richard. I think Boris obviously said in the week if the data continues to look positive, that he would bring forward that date in terms of easing restrictions. So let's actually look at the data itself. So Omicron came across the country around the middle of December, and then we saw that huge rise in cases. But as they were predicting in South Africa, because they were a bit ahead of us, that as fast as it went up in South Africa, it came down as well. And that's kind of what we've seen in the UK. But there have been a couple of things with the testing. There's been some changes in the testing protocol, which is part of the reason why some of the cases have come down. But I think we've got to stop looking at the cases and look at what you've talked about, which is kind of the death figures, and not just COVID deaths, all deaths. So the latest figures from ONS, and we've seen a similar pattern throughout most of January, Rich, is that we had 12,401 deaths registered in the last week. And actually, that's lower than what we had in 2018, 2017, and 2015. We saw a huge surge last winter, obviously, when we had that big second wave. But the current number of deaths across the country is lower than some of the years pre-pandemic. Part of the reason for that might be because we saw significant numbers of elderly people dying over the pandemic who may have been dying kind of now. But when you start looking at all-cause mortality, there's no real emergency with the numbers like we saw in the previous waves.
So we're sort of into 5-year averages plus or minus is what you're saying. And that's across the whole of the UK, not just England.
So that's the England and Wales figures, and you get a similar picture when you look at Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. And before you get to the kind of the death figures, you generally would see looking at the critical care beds. So I've actually been crunching some of the numbers this morning on this, and we talked briefly on this last time I was on with you, Richard, and then we've got now the full month of January's data in, and actually that paints a really important picture as well. So last winter, where we had a huge surge, we had to put more beds into the NHS for critical care because the number of patients in critical care last winter in January was kind of 75% above what you would expect to see in a normal winter. So quite clear, last winter we had a problem. Now this winter, with the Omicron variant, and I've seen lots of broadcasters talking about how many people are in critical care beds, and there's been a lot of discussion around people who are vaccinated, unvaccinated, and the like, and people filming from these things. If you actually start looking at the facts and figures, Richard, it's a really interesting picture there. We've actually got fewer patients over the last month this winter in critical care beds than what we've seen in 3 of the 4 winters before the pandemic started. So if you were looking at the stats, you wouldn't even think there's a pandemic at all in the country at the moment. If you're looking at
that's extraordinary, Jamie. I mean, funny that, isn't it? If you actually look at the data, look at the stats, you find out that actually, again, give or take, this is another normal winter. And yet some of these supposed experts on SAGE and in various universities, they're continuing to bang on that there is a crisis out there, but the data just simply doesn't support their position.
No, and Rich, when we went into the kind of Christmas period, there was talk for Boris to bring in further restrictions beyond the plan B that he brought in just before Christmas, with the SAGE modelers saying it could be around 2,890 deaths a day in the middle of January. We've got figures now from the ONS, which are kind of the gold standard, rather than just looking at deaths with a positive test. You can look at people who've died where COVID was put on the death certificate, and rather than 2,890, it was fewer than 200. So they were 93% out. And the previous modelling that they were doing was false as well. So the problem you get is if they're starting to come out, and I've heard people saying, are SAGE backing Boris? Well, basically, I think the SAGE credibility is probably shot now, because the numbers that they've been coming up with in the past aren't being borne out. And the best thing about this one, Rich, is that because Boris didn't bring the restrictions in, you can actually mark the homework, because but normally if they bring restrictions in, they'll say, oh, well, that's because the restrictions came in. So the SAGE modelling has been completely way out, and say the facts and figures are quite reassuring that we're probably now going into this endemic phase.
And of course, you've got the live example comparing England compared to what's gone on in Wales, where you are, where Drakeford, I think, has been rather exposed in the last 6 or 7 weeks.
No, indeed. So if you look at the pandemic from the start all the way through to the end of December now, because we get monthly figures from ONS, and remember, you get different parts of the country, you've got different age demographics, so you might find different deaths. So they've adjusted for all of that. England got hit first, and kind of especially London, we didn't have any warning, I suppose, so much about the first part of the pandemic, and England had a higher death rate than Wales in the first part of the pandemic. But remember, restrictions that were then kind of devolved from the summer of 2020, and Mark Drakeford took in more of the powers in this. And over the last 3 or 4 months, we've actually seen higher death rates in Wales, even though the restrictions have been more severe. So when you look at it in the whole, Richard, there's been no difference in the death rate between England and Wales, despite Wales having more restrictions. And actually over the last few months, probably because we didn't get so many deaths at the start, there've actually been more deaths when you adjust them for different age demographics.
And is that the same in Scotland as well, that broad picture, Jamie?
No, Scotland actually comes out much lower, and I think it's in part to do with the fact that the virus does what the virus does, and it goes around and spreads around the country. Scotland actually had a lower death rate overall, but then if you compare Wales to Scotland, they've had pretty much the same kind of restrictions. So when you start comparing lots of different countries, the restrictions themselves, you don't see a clear pattern that having more restrictions meant that you would have fewer deaths overall.
Well, essentially, that was the conclusion of the Johns Hopkins University report from the US, wasn't it? That actually, when they compared restrictions, different types of lockdowns or no lockdowns across different countries, that the difference was so small it was essentially unmeasurable.
No, I don't say we've learned a lot over the last 18 months. I think the only purpose really is this, where you would bring those restrictions is if you think the health system's going to be overwhelmed to the fact that people who really need treatment can't get it. We never got to that position in the UK. Maybe that's because of some of the restrictions early on. But if you're looking at the thing we were talking about today in terms of easing the restrictions, well, the facts are there. The NHS is no different to a normal winter now. So why would you continue with restrictions, especially as we're going into the spring? We've got to come out of this at some point. And the date is pretty reassuring. And if Boris is following that, which he says he is, I see no reason why he couldn't go ahead in a couple of weeks and start taking the restrictions out.
That sounds really good news, Jamie, that actually Boris has said he's going to look at the data after the recess. What you're saying is that you think the data will confirm the position that we should ease all the restrictions, and then actually Wales and Scotland should follow suit. Jamie, thank you so much for those thoughts. That's Jamie Jenkins, the independent statistician, who actually looks at the data and finds that actually, very often the situation is completely different from the doomsters and the modellers at the heart of government. And I've talked earlier in this show about false modelling and the impact of that and the consequences of wasting our taxpayers' cash based on dodgy modelling. We see it far too often, and I think that we have got to rail against it. Thank you very much, Jamie, indeed. But keep those calls coming in, 0344 499 1000. David here has just tweeted in, the reason they want the wells filled, this is the shale gas wells, is so there's no possibility whatsoever of restarting fracking. The eco-zealots don't care about the common sense of extracting shale gas with them. It's pure dogma. This policy is quite simply, David says, insane. I agree with that. I think we've got to look at it. There is an interesting letter in today's Sunday Telegraph from almost 30 Tory MPs signing up, including, interestingly, Lord David Frost, who is very strong on this issue, very strong on being a supporter of extracting shale gas. And this letter is saying that actually we need to restart the process of extracting shale gas. This treasure, it's there, it's ours, and it belongs to all of us. And my view is we should find the right ways to extract it. Keep those calls coming in. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio. More taste, more flavour.
Reach for the story.
More outspoken.
Error 5092. Argument failed to start.
Talk Radio. There's still a good argument for listening.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We are in the last segment of the show. I've just had my first Valentine's Day greeting from Susan, who says, I think you cover really interesting topics and produce them extremely well. Happy Valentine's Day to you, your team and your family. Thank you, Susan. So that is great news. Now, we've got from Stevenage. Steve, I like that. Steve from Stevenage. Hi there. What's one news from Stevenage, Steve?
Yeah. I was just going to talk about your idea about using the army to manage the police force.
Well, I was saying someone from the army, potentially current or former officer.
I've got some really bad news for you.
Oh, dear.
The army leadership isn't what it was 10 years ago. I'm afraid the army suffers from exactly the same things as the rest of the leadership of all industry in the country. It's not immune, I'm afraid. And it's really small at the moment. And it's more of a tri-service now. The army as such, as a standalone organisation, doesn't actually exist. It's a tri-service defence force that thinks it's a global force at the moment.
And have you been in the forces yourself?
I have. I was a reservist, and I worked in Kosovo and Bosnia.
Right.
With the reserve. And the other thing I wanted to mention to you as well is NATO in Europe isn't also what it used to be either, it's all very small, very niche, and we've all spent our money on the wrong things. 2 aircraft carriers with 7 British jets on it now, because one fell in the drink.
Yeah, one fell off. But bit embarrassing now. I get that, and I think we all know that the size of our armed forces has reduced, and indeed the size of NATO, and some countries are not contributing their 2%. But you might like to hope that actually we're focusing on quality, not quantity, and that's probably the optimist in me. I may be being a bit naive.
if I may say so, it's not that you're naive. You're thinking of how the army was, not how it is. The tri-service, and also the quality of the NATO forces is very much reduced on how it was in the 1980s, and the ROC was there in the 1980s as well. So it's not what you think it is.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, Steve. I appreciate that thought. I guess what I'm really saying is that what we're doing at the moment isn't working, and therefore we've got to be brave enough to try something different. And that's because, I come from a business background, and that's what you do. If something isn't working, you tweak it, you adapt it, you change it until you find something that does work.
One thing I would like to see is police officers dressed as police officers and not like, a paramilitary organisation with stab vests and trousers tucked in boots. Start dressing them as a civil police force. Clothes maketh the man.
Yes,
and they'll start acting like a civil police force.
Yes, equally, we've got to provide them with the right protection. Steve, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for those thoughts. That was Steve from Stevenage, and we're going to head back into London, where David is patiently waiting. Hi, David.
Hello, Richard. It's about the clean air you're talking about in Manchester.
That's right, yes. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as I say, I drive in London, and just in this 1 week, Richard, I've had 3 penalty charge notices: Ealing, Barking and Islington. And you see, they've put these low traffic neighbourhoods in so many roads, but these are put on very wide roads, and you've got small signs either side, so they're like spiders' webs,
Oh, that's absolutely right. And it's a nightmare, isn't it? Because the reality is a lot of these low traffic neighbourhood schemes, they were introduced with no consultation in the middle of COVID, with some grant funding, and actually they've led to chaos.
Yeah, and Richard, they're making it so hard for people and businesses to get around. And these people who have got low traffic neighbourhoods, they're going to be sitting there thinking this is very nice, but they're not going to be able to get a cab. They're not going to be able to get a plumber to come there because they don't want to sit in all that traffic or the risk of getting a penalty charge notice.
It's complete madness. We've seen it all over London. You've got huge areas. I see it. And actually all that's happening is traffic is being slowed to a halt. And of course, it's people in the private sector. It's taxi drivers, the self-employed, the doers, the shakers, the motivators that are getting penalised the most. It drives me bonkers.
Yeah, Richard, you can't go into central London and have a few drinks and then get on a bicycle home. You need to get a cab.
Well, that sounds like the safe thing to do, but of course the cab is so expensive and the cab is crawling along at an absolute snail's pace. It's the money, and it's our money that is poured into creating these schemes. I've actually seen LTN schemes in central London where the local residents are so cross they've actually they've taken off the signage and they've knocked off the cameras. Now, none of us are condoning illegal activity or behaviour, but that is just an indication of the frustration and the anger that people are experiencing.
And Richard, by installing these LTNs, to me, that is a form of graffiti. You see what I mean? They're sort of ruining our landscape by putting these low traffic neighbourhoods in. That, to me, is vandalism by councils.
Oh, it is complete vandalism, and it's the lack of consultation imposing these restrictions. Of course, all it does is generate huge sums of taxing people in order to prop up councils' budgets so that they can waste them on diversity and inclusion officers, and that drives me mad. David, just tell me, where are you on net zero? Do you want a referendum on net zero?
100%, Richard. 100%, yes.
And what about your mates? Tell me, what are your friends saying? How much are people sort of chatting about this at home or in the pub or at work?
It's driving people mad, Richard, and it's also stressing people. People are getting stressed. And that's the problem. It's really, and stress is very, very unhealthy, Yeah.
Completely. Stress is, we all do silly things when we're stressed.
Yeah.
And
the man you had at the top when his businesses, 2 lorries he's had to buy, it's a scandal.
No, that's absolutely right. Well, he had to get rid of an employee who was running a small business, working hard, and not easy in the transport business, and he had to lay someone off, sell 1 lorry in order to pay for a brand new lorry for a scheme that's going to spend potentially hundreds of millions of taxpayers' cash, and then it might be stopped by the man. You couldn't make this stuff up.
No, you couldn't make it. You couldn't make it up, Richard.
Well, we need to try and stop it. That is absolutely for sure. David, thank you so much for those thoughts. Keep telling people and talking about this. I think we're really on to something, certainly judging by the messages we're getting. One here from John who says, please try to get David Frost on the show about the imbecilic of stopping shale gas. It's becoming urgent. It absolutely is. Another one here from, I think it's Roe, who says the point of net zero is to grow the state to even greater proportions than now, at which point it will never, ever shrink. I love this. This is a great one to think about, almost finishing off. A text message has come. If the clean air zones are a direct result of EU legislation, shouldn't this be something that the newly appointed Cabinet Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg should be looking to undo in his position as Brexit Opportunities Minister? I thought we'd left the EU for our benefit. I like that. That is a very fine way to conclude our thoughts and our tweets. We've been covering all sorts of things on the show this morning. Time has flown by, and into the studio has breezed the wonderful Bob Mills, who's going to tell us. Good afternoon, Bob.
Very good afternoon to you.
Lovely to see you.
David Frost.
David Frost. Yes.
Have two people with the same name ever held such huge, powerful positions?
It is extraordinary, isn't it?
It is.
It really is extraordinary.
It's not a common name.
No, it's
now,
not a common
let
name.
me put this to you. Well, yeah, what is going on? I'm going to talk about a new book that's out for writer Helen Rappaport. And if I was to say to you, it's about a nurse in the Crimea, what would your first thought be? Florence.
I'm not sure. Florence, yes. Florence. It's got to be Florence, yes.
Well, it's not.
It's not.
It's not. Because as wonderful as Florence was,
yes,
and we should all laud her, let's never forget Mary Seacole.
There we are.
And that's where we're going.
Right.
And I promise you there'll be loads of people out there saying, about time. About time.
About time we talked about that, right?
We're talking about Mary Seacole. And then we've got, you know what? I don't do specials, but it's Valentine's Day.
It's Valentine's Day. I know.
Apparently.
I've had my first message on Twitter, my first support. You don't look terribly enthusiastic about Valentine's. Come on, Bob.
No. You reach an age, Richard. You'll know. When you get to my age, you'll know. It's rather tiresome. When you look at a beautiful bunch of roses in September and think, oh, they're lovely, and look at that price, what a reasonable price.
Yes.
And then suddenly February rolls along.
Funny that, isn't it?
Really? Has there been a crash in the rose market?
What's gone on?
What's happened? It's
I
like
know.
It's like the tulips.
The tulip mania. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, well, there we are. So it doesn't sound as though you're spending a fortune on roses for Valentine's. What?
Of course I am. Of course I am. What I say on my radio world has nothing to do with
the reality of what's really going on.
The brazen coward I am when it comes.
It sounds like I'm a bit worried that you're sounding like a politician there. Oh dear, oh dear.
That's the one thing I can guarantee people for the next 3 hours. No politics.
No politics indeed. Well, there's plenty of politics on my Twitter feed. I mean, you know, we've been talking about all sorts, but in particular, the madness of energy, and people do want a referendum. Shale gas, that's coming to 4. People want a referendum on net zero.
I'm going to just say this very quickly to all our listeners who we love and respect and admire. In about 10 minutes, I'll look down at that screen and it'll say, and another thing about shale gas, and I kind of want to say, yeah, Richard's gone.
No, it's gone. Well, that's right. People have got to, you know, they've got to send the message and get in early, get the calls in early. It's amazing, though. The switchboard has been absolutely full.
It keeps going, non-stop.
It keeps going. It's been a full-on show. Thank you to my wonderful production team who've kept me on the straight and narrow and ensured that all the guests and the callers have come through. And we've had some amazing tweets, messages. I'll be back this time next week, of course. Another great Sunday sermon, lots of fantastic